I want to introduce also Seth Magle. So he started off, as you may have read, with prairie dogs in Boulder, Colorado, and that sort of piqued his interest. I think that happens around here too, just watching wildlife out your backyard, but we don't have things as exotic as prairie dogs, I'd say. And then got his master's at the University of Wisconsin and his doctorate at Colorado State. He's been researching urban wildlife for more than 20 years. He's the director of the Urban Wildlife Institute at Lincoln Park Zoo and executive director of the Urban Wildlife Information Network, which has 23 cities that participate in that. And I'd love to hear more about that, as well as local and wider. So Dr. Magle, if you'll come join us.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to talk to you today. I'm going to tell you about the research we've been doing for a rather long time now at the Lincoln Park Zoo, but along the way, hopefully teaching you some things that maybe you knew, maybe you didn't, about our urban wildlife neighbors. But I'll start just by putting this in context a little bit. So I am a guy who works at a zoo, right? And when you think about zoos and you think about the work they do outside of the zoo out in the world, you're probably picturing faraway places, exotic spaces, big, charismatic, megafauna-y kinds of animals. If you're a zoo and you want to do conservation, there's a pretty stereotyped way that most of them do it. You figure out what is the biggest, fuzziest, cutest thing that you have at your zoo, and then you figure out where it lives in the real world, and then you go out there and you figure out what's killing them there. And there's always something killing them there, poachers or deforestation, doesn't matter. And you work on that. That's what most zoos do, and it makes sense. And we do that too. We actually do a lot of work in Tanzania and Ngombe and the Congo, protecting big primates and rhinos and things like that. So we do that too, but I don't. So my life is weird because my study area does not look like that. It is not remote. It is not exotic like you are all sitting in my study area right now, actually. And the animals that I study mostly are not rare. They're not endangered. They're not at any risk of disappearance. They are things you know. They're things you've seen, like foxes and raccoons. So whenever I give a talk like this, I first come prepared to sort of explain why we do that. Like, why is that interesting or useful? Because we are a little weird in the way that we do this urban wildlife science as a zoo. I believe there's three main reasons why it matters to study urban wildlife. First is conflict. We live in the city, animals live in cities, and bad things happen, right? This can be everything from things that are just kind of funny, like when a raccoon knocks over your trash can, kind of annoying, not really a big deal, to things that really are scary, like when you hit a deer with your car, or if you contract a disease from a wildlife species, right? Animals live in cities, and so do we, and if we understood why they live in cities, what they're doing here, how they move around and live their lives, we could reduce these conflicts and create a more harmonious situation for us and for them at the same time. That's one reason. Second reason is pretty obvious. We're a zoo. We want to connect people to nature. Well, we know now that the vast majority of the world's population live in cities, and that percentage is increasing all the time. If we want to connect people to nature, to me, it makes sense that the starting point is to connect them to the nature where they are, to their nature. I feel kind of weird when I go out and talk to a bunch of inner city Chicago kids about the importance of protecting rhinos, right? They're never going to see a rhino in the wild, probably. Well, a few of them will. Most of them won't. But they will all see songbirds in their neighborhood. They can all see coyotes if they work at it. They can all see raccoons. That's relevant to their lives, and I think it's a good place to start to get people to care more widely about nature in a broad sense. Third reason is the hardest, and I think also the most important, and that is conservation. For a long time, people have said, well, we don't do conservation in cities, because in our traditional conservation narrative, the cities are the villains, right? We have this perfect, unspoiled nature. It's where the animals live. The city comes in, it wipes everything out, and it's just this horrible, evil thing that exists on the landscape. And what we need to do is make nature preserves. And the nature preserves, that's where the nature will be. Kind of a fine approach to start with, but the reality is, as our world continues to urbanize, we can't protect all of the species we want to in nature preserves. And I'm not even sure we would want to, because we want, in many cases, people to be able to experience that nature, for it to be a part of their lives. So what that means is that we need to complicate this narrative. We need to move away from cities are just the bad guys and think about how can we make that not true? How could we make cities part of the solution? What would that look like? Urban nature that really was healthy, that was flourishing without creating conflict with people. It's a hard problem because as a scientist, as an ecologist, I can't do that alone. I have to do that with landscape architects and urban planners and politicians and economists. It's hard. I have to step outside my bubble, but I believe strongly that the future of wildlife conservation really is in the city. So my colleagues do not always agree with me on this. It's a little bit of a heretical position to say that cities can be part of the solution for nature. And I hear often from my colleagues and from, for example, agencies that give grants, that there's really no reason to spend time and effort in these cities. That, again, that it's just this nightmare of concrete, nothing lives there that matters, and that we should spend our time with something else. And that's disheartening to hear, but what I am encouraged by is that if you turn around to the general public, the people who live in the cities, you find out that they care a lot. They have a lot of questions. But these animals that they see, what are they doing? Why are they here? Does this belong here? Does it belong over there? What's going on? And they want scientists to be part of the solution to understand what should our urban ecology, our urban environment look like. I want to say briefly that this is not a Chicago problem, right? Every city in the world has urban wildlife. The species are different, but they all have their own species. So I got my start with these guys, these little prairie dogs here in the tiny little sidewalk strip in Denver, Colorado. But if I was giving this talk in Alaska, we could go on and on about urban grizzly bears. In Florida, we could go on and on about urban alligators. California, we could go on and on about urban mountain lions. Every city has urban wildlife. And I would argue no city has a systematic scientific approach to figuring out how do we curate that urban wildlife? What do we want to live with? What do we not want to live with? What would that look like if we really looked at the city from their perspective? So that general line of thinking is how in 2009, the Lincoln Park Zoo started the Urban Wildlife Institute. And our mission is to do the research necessary to help people and wildlife coexist in cities all around the world. Most of our work takes place in Chicago. I'll talk to you a little bit later about some of our work outside of Chicago, but most of it is right here in the third largest city in the US. And Chicago is cool ecologically for a lot of reasons. We have a lot of big green spaces. We have the lakefront conserved, all of that. We also, though, have a lot of urban wildlife celebrities. And I wanted to briefly go through some of those because I think they're interesting stories. This one's not ours. This is P22, the famous California mountain lion. Some other famous urban wildlife celebrities. I'm old, maybe some of you remember the show Northern Exposure. Their opening credits had this like moose wandering through the city, which I thought was cool. Pizza Rat, anybody remember Pizza Rat? It was like a big thing on social media recently. In New York, you have pale male, right? The famous peregrine falcon who actually there wasn't one pale male, by the way. It's been going on for like 30 years. It's been like 6 pale males. But anyway, famous peregrine falcons that live on top of buildings in New York. So big cities have famous wildlife celebrities. I thought we'd walk through a few of ours. Maybe some of you remember these stories. Anybody remember the Quiznos coyote? 2008, coyote walked into a Quiznos and the loop wouldn't leave. Became a whole thing, never forget. This is interesting, right? People ask me these kinds of stories all the time, like why would a coyote do that? And the real answer is we don't know because we don't understand a lot about how these urban animals make decisions, how they move around the landscape, how they live their lives. Okay, more recent example, Chonkosaurus. Everybody remember Chonkosaurus, this enormous snapping turtle that was seen in the Chicago River? I like Chonkosaurus because it's a story that reminds us that the Chicago River not that long ago was a joke, right? I mean, it was so polluted, no one thought anything could live in it. Now we have this giant snapping turtle. Now we have otters. The otters are coming back to the Chicago River. That is so cool to me. And it reminds us that these urban spaces can be cleaned up more easily than we think. It's not easy. I shouldn't say that. My friends at Friends of the Chicago River would not agree with that. It takes a lot of work, but it can be done relatively quickly. So one of my favorite stories, Monty and Rose, people know this one, the piping plovers who showed up at Montrose Beach and kind of ruined all revenue for that part of the Chicago Park District for a little while, but we didn't care because they're so cool. Federally endangered bird that is choosing to kind of make part of its stand in the heart of a big city. It's so exciting because, again, conservation, we can do conservation in the city. And the community, I was really impressed to see how the community really rallied around these birds. And I think now they just renamed the beach after them. So it's a whole thing. We can really garner a lot of support with these urban wildlife ambassadors. Sometimes the story's a little more unfortunate. They don't even have to be native to the system. Anybody remember Chance the Snapper, right? This alligator, which was probably someone's pet, but then was released and running around, which makes us wrestle with questions like, okay, what do we do in those kinds of situations? What animals should we be allowed to own in the city? And what should we do when they suddenly appear somewhere they don't belong, where they're going to die in the winter? My team was actually a big part of this story, these foxes that were found in Millennium Park last year. We actually did a lot of tracking and monitoring of these guys. Just kind of a cool story where no one expected foxes to be there and to be doing well, but they seem to be doing well, and they raised several kits in that space. There was some amazing photography, not mine, but some amazing photography of these guys. Again, showing us that in places in the city that are really highly urbanized, where we don't expect nature can kind of make a stand, sometimes it can. And then I'm going to close with the story that was a bane in my life the last 3 or 4 months. Everybody know about the Chicago rat hole? Chicago rat hole is the thing. So just a hole in the sidewalk that everyone in the media wanted to talk to me about for about 2 weeks. There's all kinds of media about it, and somebody put up a plaque back. Some dudes got married there. It was like a whole thing. I had the temerity to say that that hole was made by a squirrel because it was. I'm sorry, it just was. And the city of Chicago just screamed no at me on Twitter. So somehow I enraged the entire city over this rat hole. And then some dude thought I looked like Lionel Messi, which anyway, it doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. Anyway, Chicago rat hole. What it reminds us is that even in the city, we are desperate for some kind of connection to animals, even like rats, even animals we don't want to be here. They're just so interesting to us. Think about how most of our sports teams are named after animals, right? We just have this intrinsic need, even when we live in a big concrete jungle, to be somehow connected to these other species, sometimes in weird and obnoxious ways. All right, but I want to tell you a little bit more about our science journey at the zoo, because I think you'll find it interesting and sort of how we came here. So we started with these big ideas about living with wildlife, but we didn't really know how feasible that was. They were kind of newish ideas. We weren't sure any of that was going to work. So we thought we need a test bed. We needed to kind of pilot test these ideas on a local scale. And what would that look like? And fortunately, at the exact same time, we were trying to figure out what to do with this pond south of the zoo. It used to be called South Pond. I don't know how many of you know the zoo well, but there's a little pond south of the zoo. And in 2004, it looked like this. It was a paddle boat pond, concrete lined pond, like any city park pond you would see. And it really hadn't changed in a very long time. In fact, if you look at photographs from 1890s, basically the same pond, people wearing much better hats, but otherwise totally the same place. But we said, okay, we're starting this urban wildlife center. We're talking about people and nature. What if we made it a nature space? What if we made it a wildlife space? See, people can use it, but it'll be mostly for animals. See if the animals will find it, see if they'll use it, see if people hate it, see what happens. So it is now called Nature Boardwalk. This is kind of what it looks like now. It's been completely replanted with native plants. It's this kind of pond sedge ecosystem we built. Here's an aerial shot of Nature Boardwalk. It's beautiful. I love going there. And then the spoiler at the end of the story is it worked. We have an amazing amount of wildlife that use the space, even right close to downtown where we are. We've seen over 300 species of birds make use of this space during migration. We have 7 species of turtles in the pond, only one of which we introduced. The other 6 found it on their own. We have many, many different species of bats, mammals, insects, obviously plants, but we plant the plants, so that's there's this amazing diversity of life that exists at the space, and people really seem to like it. And we've done a lot of outreach programming there, teaching people about local nature, how to interact with wildlife in a safe way. It's been a really nice laboratory for our learning team to really connect the public. So really the space was pretty successful. And then the crowning achievement of it was that as we built it, these guys showed up. So this is a black-crowned night heron. This is a state endangered bird. And at this point, they come back every year and they nest around the pond and around the zoo. And now it's the largest remaining colony of this bird in the state. So this bird has chosen our zoo in the heart of Chicago as the place that they're like, okay, we're going to hang on right here. And every year we see more. So it's not like they're dying out. They're flourishing in this tiny, weird little urban space that we built. And I think, again, it reminds us that it's not easy, but we can bring nature into the city, and we can do it in a way that's good for them and doesn't seem to bother at least our local community. People seem happy to have the birds around, and they're kind of interesting to watch. So our ideas seem to work at that small local scale, which was good. It meant I got to keep having a job, so I liked that part. But it also meant we had to think bigger. So, okay, what can we do across the metro area, not just the city, but the whole metro area, to advance these ideas? We can't build little ponds everywhere. That's not feasible. But what can we do to advance this process of people and wildlife coexisting? So we spent a lot of time talking about this and having really nerdy scientific discussions about hypotheses and stuff, basically trying to figure out, like, how are we going to science this massive question, all these unexplored species and questions across this whole region? What we ultimately decided was, we said, okay, there's so little known about this whole wildlife across this area that we need to cast a really wide net. So we set up over 100 field monitoring stations across the metro area, and those are the colored dots on this map. And they initiate downtown. Those are the orange dots, kind of right in the urban core. And then they go out along these 3 imaginary lines we call transects, so that we can capture what happens to the wildlife community in the more suburban areas and ultimately the almost rural areas at the end. These are about 35-mile long transects. And we decided we're going to set up these field stations. We're going to maintain them forever, or as long as we can keep the money coming. And we're going to collect as much data as we can. That means we're going to collect data in all 4 seasons. We're never going to stop. We'll just keep collecting data, even in the dead of winter. And we're going to use all the different cool technologies we can think of to gather data on different types of animals. So that means we use camera traps to study the larger mammals. We use pitfall traps to study the bugs. We use a couple different methods to study the birds, actually. We use mist netting to live capture them, and we also use acoustic monitoring, so we record their songs. We're going to collect data on vegetation. We're going to collect data on bats using ultrasonic monitors that can hear the ultrasonic calls that bats make. I didn't do this, but we even teamed up with a guy who studies ants. We're like, okay, go study ants across these 100 sites. That sounds great. So anything anybody wants to study across these 100 sites, we're going to say yes. We're just going to always say yes, and we're going to throw it all in a big bucket and create the biggest data set anyone's ever seen on urban wildlife. That's what we decided to do. And it's working pretty well. The funny thing for me when I go out is like, this site's cool. This is like a nice buckthorn invaded forest preserve where I work, setting up a camera trap there. And I like doing these sites, but a lot of people have studied wildlife in the nature preserves, right? Like the forest preserves. This is something that's been doing since we built forest preserves. I weirdly get more excited about sites like this. Like I'm just putting a camera trap under the L. And no one has ever thought to look to see what lives there before. So in a weird way, even though thousands of people walk through this park every day, it's kind of like I'm exploring an unexplored country when it comes to animals. Since I have you here, of course, as a captive audience, I have to show off some of our camera trap pictures that I like. Sometimes, especially when I see you all sort of drifting off, I like to do this as a pop quiz. See what your wildlife knowledge is. So feel free to call out the animals in these pictures. They start off easy. Don't worry, they'll get a little trickier later. Yeah, white-tailed deer, not in the city, of course, but in the suburbs. We are overrun with the white-tailed deer because of the famous quote from Aldo Leopold, when we eliminate the wolf, we inherit its job, right? So now we have that job. Squirrel, which one? We got two. I think this one's a fox squirrel. It's got that real reddish belly. There's a whole secret war going on between the fox squirrels and the gray squirrels in the city that no one knows anything about, but sort of starting to learn a little bit about it. I can go into that more later if you want. Yep, striped skunks. People don't like them, but I mean, apart from spraying people, they really don't do anything offensive. I kind of like skunks. Awesome. Similarly, bad rep. I think if they had fuzzy tails, everyone would love opossums, but they got that naked little rat tail and everybody's like, ew, but they don't really do anything to people. Anyway. Raccoon on its hind legs, which worries me. I'm going to tell you, that's a little scary to me. We start walking on their hind legs, we're in trouble. Coyotes, there are so many coyotes in the city. We think between 2,000 and 3,000 in Cook County. They are really doing very well. They've learned to look both ways when they cross streets, which is kind of amazing to me. When I started my job, everybody was saying like, oh, they don't belong in the city. They're never going to hang on here. Well, I'll tell you that, and they belong here now. They decided. They didn't ask us. They decided they belong here now. So I really like this shot of a coyote in a cemetery. And it's a red fox specifically. We used to have a lot of gray fox around, and they have basically disappeared in the last 20 years from the city, which I think is pretty sad. But our red fox are holding on kind of okay, like the Millennium Park ones that I showed you, but they seem to be losing a battle with coyotes, I think is what's happening. Beaver is often the first guess, but I heard groundhog, and that is the correct answer. Or woodchuck, same animal. I actually employ a woman who is the world's expert on urban woodchucks because she's the only person who's ever studied urban woodchucks, and they're very cool, actually. True hibernators and all that stuff. That one's a beaver. Yes, very good. You know, the beavers are everywhere, and the park district is like enraged with them. I have all these meetings with them where they're like, how do we get them to stop chewing our trees? And I'm like, I don't know, cage your trees. Like, beaver's gonna beaver. Like, that's just what they do. So I had this woman in tears in my office the other day telling me how they had planted these memorial trees for people who had died, and she was so mad at the beaver. And I was like, beaver doesn't know that or care. The beaver does not care that the people died. I'm sorry. Anyway, beavers, whole other thing. Flying squirrel. Suddenly, like the last 3 years, we have flying squirrels everywhere. I don't know why. If anyone should know why, it's me, and I don't. But they're crushing it, and it's weird to me. And I'm going to try to find out why. But I think they're sort of cute and kind of interesting, so I'm all about it. Here's a mink. You guys are good. That is a mink. They're not in the city, but in the suburbs, especially like along the Salt Creek Greenway, we see a lot of mink. They have some little pockets that are doing very well. Okay, that ends the pop quiz part. Now we go to the species interaction. So I love when I can get 2 or more animals on a photo because I can start to get a little bit of a sense of how they interact. Like, you know, this raccoon looks a little wary of this coyote, I would say, as opposed to this raccoon and this deer who understandably do not care about each other. No risk of predation there. But then you've got this raccoon and opossum sort of standoff, right? So seems to be some competitive interaction. Now, if any of you have ever worked with camera traps, you know that they are not smart and they will take a picture of literally anything that moves in front of them. So we also get pictures of dogs, we get pictures of cats and miscellaneous. All kinds of weird stuff happens on our camera traps. Sometimes it's a challenge sometimes with camera traps in cities. People always ask me, don't you sort of lose all your camera traps? It can happen. So these little Jedis do not look scary, but they actually broke 2 of my cameras on one day, which was annoying. And another challenge sometimes is you can't always tell what's on a camera trap image. Sometimes the identification is challenging. This is a dude wearing a Halloween mask on purpose to mess with me. However, when I get dogs and cats and chickens and this guy on my camera, I also want to note that we have a big database. We track everything that we record, and that includes humans and their pets. And the reason is we want to understand the ecology of the system, how it is tied together. You can't understand a city without understanding people. They're the major driver in this whole system. And for example, we know from our statistical modeling that one of the most critical factors that affects how many coyotes you see at a site is how many humans walk in front of that same camera. The more humans, the fewer coyotes. They're very good at avoiding this, even in the heart of our city. So we've been doing this for a very long time, and the camera trap part of the study alone, which is the biggest part, is the largest urban wildlife study ever conducted in the world, which is kind of exciting to do that out of one little free zoo in Chicago. You can see there some of our stats. We have an immense amount of data at our disposal now. Just briefly, I'll talk about a few of our other data sources. We have quite a bit of data on bats as well, not 100 sites, but a lot of sites where we use ultrasonic recorders, which can detect, bats use little pulses to catch their prey. We can't hear that. But we have technology that can, and it can turn that into a sound wave that we can actually identify to a species. We have 7 species of bats in Chicago. Some of them are really strongly affected by diseases, and we want to understand how they're doing. So we try to keep a pretty good eye on these different bat populations, and we make maps, like these maps, to sort of see, okay, where do we have larger bat populations in the city? Finding, for example, they're really strongly affected by things like light and noise. But I don't have time to go into all of it, but we do a lot. I know I said in my title slide I was going to talk about rats. I could do a whole hour on rats because we have a whole project called the Chicago Rat Project, trying to understand why Orkin keeps calling us the rattiest city in the country every single year. I really don't think we are. I'm almost sure it's New York, but we do have a lot of rats. And the rats are not equitably distributed, right? They're mostly in the black and brown neighborhoods and in the poor neighborhoods, and we're trying to understand why that is. What are the drivers that lead to these rat infestations? When does the city respond? When do they not respond? So rats are a whole thing. We also do tick dragging, trying to understand where there are ticks and people are at risk for Lyme disease. We do a lot of stuff. Just say that. So I wanted to tell you about a couple of the ways we connect all this science to the public, and 2 major programs in particular. The first is a program we have called Partners in Fieldwork. This is a program where we go to middle schools and high schools in underserved communities in Chicago, and we give them all of the cool science tech that we use. We give them camera traps, and we give them bat monitors and binoculars to count birds. We train them, and we basically turn their school and its grounds into one of our field stations. It's great for me. I get more data. I love more data. But I think more importantly, it's helping to expose kids to careers in STEM and train the next generation of urban wildlife biologists, which I think is just super rewarding. Another outreach program we have that all of you can be a part of if you want is called Chicago Wildlife Watch. This is a website we built in conjunction with the Adler Planetarium. Chicago Wildlife Watch, if you go there, it works on mobile devices or on your computer, whatever. Within a couple seconds of getting there, you're going to be looking at images from our camera traps that are all across the city. There might be an animal in the image, there might not be. We're asking you to help us identify the animals in those images, which is a step we need to get done to get our data ready for analysis. But at the same time, hopefully, we're helping to train people how to tell the difference between a dog and a coyote, between a fox and a dog, all these different comparisons. There's a nice little guide on the right that'll kind of help walk you through some of the important factors. But mostly I love this because it enables anyone who says, I think your work is cool, I wish I could be a part of it, within 2 or 3 clicks, they can be. So yeah, if you want to check that out, just go to chicagowildlifewatch.org. So then I want to talk about the third tier, the most difficult tier, as I said, of the work we do, which is trying to connect our work to conservation by engaging with urban planners, landscape architects, politicians to say, how could we make a more wildlife-friendly Chicago metro area? What would that look like? How would we give animals a seat at the table when we decide what gets built and where and when? So I spend a lot of time taking off my science hat and putting on my policy hat and having a lot of conversations with folks. That's actually me talking to Congressman Mike Quigley on the top right. And sort of consulting on projects, large-scale projects around Chicago, like the Burnham Wildlife Corridor and the Wild Mile, just trying to be that obnoxious voice for animals that's always saying, what can we do to make this a little more permeable to wildlife and nature without creating conflict for people. Right now, a project where we're doing a lot of that is the Obama Presidential Center, the Obama Library on the south side. We're working a lot with them. They really want that site to be wildlife friendly. We are sort of engaged with them to try to figure out how to help make that happen. We've got camera traps all around that site right now during construction, tracking what's there. Are they going up? Are they going down? Kind of what's happening. And that's been exciting to be a part of that project. Had a very unique opportunity a couple years ago that was very exciting. The city of Chicago actually reached out to us and said, we think it's time to update our wildlife management plan for the city, and we think that you should basically write it. So working with the Animal Care and Control Department in Chicago, we created this wildlife management and coexistence plan informed by our science and really intended to move the needle away from sort of management, meaning like capture and kill things, which sometimes you still have to do. But move the needle away from that and more towards, can we coexist with many of these species? Is it possible in many of these cases that the conflict isn't really as dangerous or as devastating as maybe we originally thought? So very few scientists really get the opportunity to like sit down and write city policy. It was very exciting to get to do that. And there's been a little bit of media to suggest that maybe it's already been a little bit successful. I hope that's true. And it's sort of reduced the number of 311 calls about wildlife problems, which is very exciting because myself and my team, we really are not interested in doing the kind of science that's purely theoretical. We want to do the kind of work that makes a difference on the ground. And this is, I hope, a good example. But at some point, our research got a little bit big even for our city because we realized that our goal all along, I told you at the beginning, our mission is to do the research necessary to help people and wildlife coexist in cities around the world. But we were doing all of our work in Chicago, and what that meant was that when I got a call from a colleague in San Francisco, and he'd say, oh, I loved your paper about what's going on with your coyotes, but is that what's going on with my coyotes? I had to say, well, I don't know. Cities are really different. So even though it's the same species, it's a coyote in Chicago or San Francisco, they might be behaving differently. Your landscape might be leading to different patterns and outcomes. I don't know how to answer your question. That was frustrating to me. I'm a scientist. I like to answer questions. So the only thing we could come up with is we said, okay, we've been studying wildlife here in Chicago for a long time. We got pretty good at it. Well, if we were a business, what would we do? We'd franchise it. Right? We'd just create a franchise system. Well, why can't we? Why can't we reach out to our scientist friends in these other cities and say, we've got this technique, it works pretty well, you should use it. And if you use it and we're using it and we're collecting data the same way at the same times of year, the exact same manner, then we can compare our notes and we can actually say, are your coyotes like my coyotes? Are your raccoons like my raccoons? Is there something that every raccoon everywhere in the world does? Are there universal truths about raccoons and then ones that are kind of local and different? That would be really cool. So to do that, we created this network called the Urban Wildlife Information Network, or sometimes I say UN, and that's essentially what it is. It's a big science franchise where we collect data in different cities and we pool it together here in Chicago so that for the first time, really in the history of this discipline, we can go beyond local studies of urban wildlife and towards continental scale and eventually global scale studies of urban wildlife. I'm surprised actually at how quickly this idea caught on. You can kind of see on this map as partners are appearing, we very quickly added a lot of partners across the United States and then really across North America. And now I think actually you had sort of in the introduction, that number is a little outdated. We have 53 partners now across 6 countries and 3 continents that are all part of this network, all collecting data, the exact same protocols that we developed here in Chicago starting in the early 2010s and kind of perfected. And we're adding more all the time. Very quickly, we'll be adding partners in Brazil, Argentina, Costa Rica. So this map is going to look more and more filled in. And just as a scientist, it really widens the scope of what we can do when we go from just having data in our backyard to really having data in many, many different kinds of cities that are built differently in different climate types, right? Cities in the desert, cities in the wetlands, cities in the south, cities in the north. We can really put all of this together to understand what is our blueprint for wildlife-friendly cities? What are the things we can do that'll work anywhere? And what are the things that you can only do in certain types of places in order to live with wildlife? Right now, most of our partners are primarily using camera traps because that's how we got started. But over time, we're going to press them towards using these are the bat monitors, those acoustic bat monitors for studying birds, all the different techniques that we use in Chicago. We will slowly roll them out in many of these other cities as well. So this is exciting for me as a scientist for a lot of reasons. One is if I wake up one day with like a crazy idea in my head about what's going on with like urban moose, right? I can't answer that question with Chicago data. We don't have urban moose, but our Seattle partners have urban moose, and I can tap into their data and see if I'm right. So it's very exciting, and more people are becoming part of it. I told you when we were just working in Chicago, we had the world's largest urban wildlife data set. That's true. Now that we're working across all these cities, I'm just going to say we have the biggest urban wildlife data set that will ever exist. Not just, we just have such a colossal amount of information, and it lets us answer really complicated, nerdy science questions. It also lets us answer really basic questions. So like, question I get asked a lot is like, well, let's just say across North America, what's the most common thing you see on your camera traps, not including humans, in North America? What do you guys think? What would be the winner across all these cities in the US and Canada? What's the most common species we see? So I think it would be squirrel, but you have to remember it's not one species of squirrel out there, right? There's like red squirrels and gray squirrels and fox squirrels, so they kind of split the vote. So I'll give you that. It's not rabbits, kind of the same problem. You've got your eastern cottontails, and then you've got your swamp rabbits and stuff. Not chipmunks. Raccoons. Totally raccoons. They're just really good at digging into our trash with their weird little thumbs. But if you look at this graph, what you can see is if you combined gray and fox squirrels into one thing, they would beat raccoons. So it would be squirrels. But like I said, they split the vote. So yeah, we can answer really basic questions like that too. Like who's the most urban of the most urban? Now, I am not a stats guy. I employ a stats guy, which is cool, because if he was here, he'd give you a whole talk about how once you have all these data from all these places, you can use mind-bendingly complicated statistics and really big computers, actually, and you can understand exactly what lives where and why. And you can do this species by species, sort of ecosystem by ecosystem, and you can really start to understand, like, why are coyotes so good at living in cities? Why are gray foxes so bad at it? Why are there some cities where the gray foxes hold on and some where they absolutely disappear, like in Chicago? It just enables us to answer these questions in a way we never could before, which is then what I need when I turn around and go to these policymakers and planners, because they don't want a complicated answer. They don't want, oh, well, sometimes it's this, unless that, and if the moon comes, they don't want any of that. They want to know, what do I do to get rid of these rats, right? And I can only come to those sort of relatively global answers, those relatively simple global answers, by crunching massive amounts of numbers from all of these spaces. That's what we can do now. I'll close by telling you a little bit about some of the next steps that we have for our network. We're going to continue to work on these plans for coexistence. We've been writing a lot of papers lately about this, like what can people do to sort of coexist with wildlife. We're actually working on this website right now in conjunction with the University of Wisconsin at Madison called the Urban Wildlife Project, and it's still in progress. You can go there now, but it's still in progress. But the idea is this is going to be a one-stop shop for anyone at any scale who wants to have actions they can do to live more wildlife friendly. If you rent an apartment, what can you do? If you own a home and it has a yard, what can you do? If you have access to a green roof, what can you do? If you are an architect and you are planning a building, what can you do? We're going to have all of it here on this site because I think that's going to be really important for people moving forward. I mentioned that we kind of are mostly doing camera traps globally. The next big push is we're going to be using these little guys. This is an audio moth and it just records noises. And we can set these out. They're very cheap. They're cheaper than camera traps. And we can put them all over the network, all over the network out in the landscape, and they will record birdsong. And we just recently perfected we accessed some artificial intelligence tools, some AI tools that go through all of that sound, splits it up into little tiny pieces, separates it out the same way you separate like the drums and the bass from your rock track, finds the bird songs, figures out what bird they are. And it's going to be so cool when we can implement that across all these sites. We're going to have a really good idea of where the birds are across all these cities, the ones that sing, I should say that, only the ones that sing. But that's going to be an amazing step forward. Well, my cool data will not just be mammals, it will also be birds. We also, because of the way our design is built, I didn't really talk to you a lot about this, but because we require all of our partners to sample across their cities, all the different parts of the cities where they work, what that means is that we have data, and previous researchers really didn't do this, from many different types of neighborhoods, rich neighborhoods and poor neighborhoods and white neighborhoods and neighborhoods of people of color. And that means we can look to see what different wildlife experiences are people having in these different communities. And what we know, this is not really a surprise, is that wildlife experiences are not equitably distributed. And a lot of people are having a really bad time with their wildlife, while other people are having relatively good time with their wildlife. And so we kind of alone have the data to address this and to say, what can we do to help everyone to be able to have positive experiences with wildlife and to make the risks associated with living with wildlife a little more equitably distributed. And so we're very excited to pivot some of our network towards these social issues and social justice. We're already working on, well, we have a manuscript coming out looking at the effects of gentrification on wildlife in neighborhoods. We're working on one with the same analysis, but with segregation. And you will not be surprised to know that those sort of historical legacies of racism have a major impact on the wildlife communities that we see. We're filling in the map. We're filling in the map all the time. It looks pretty good to me across North America. I'd love a few more cities in Mexico. We only have Mexico City, but in the end, at the end of my career, I really hope I'll be able to look at this map of the Urban Wildlife Information Network and say, hey, we're pretty good. We have pretty good coverage across different types of cities around the world. We're not there yet, but I think we'll get there. You know, I'm going to give myself a little slack considering we started again from one small free zoo in Chicago. Urban wildlife issues, I think a lot of my colleagues think they can just sort of bury their head in the sand and they'll go away, but they won't, because urbanization continues to intensify. And like I said, a higher percentage of the world's population move to cities or are born in cities every single year. And these issues are not going to go away in my lifetime or probably any of your lifetimes. And I think that as biologists, my colleagues and I, we need to pivot from thinking about how do I get as far away from people as I can? How do I get as deep into the deep, deep woods as I can get to collect my data? We need to think about what's happening around me, and could that be useful? Not to say that we don't need preserves, that we don't need work in those sort of untraversed parts of nature. We do, but I think more of us need to pivot to doing work that's going to have a direct impact on people and their lives. I think that's going to be really important. A long time ago, Aldo Leopold in the San County Almanac has my favorite quote, which is, "The weeds in a city lot convey the same lesson as the redwoods." I think when we think about Chonkosaurus and we think about those black-crowned night herons that I told you about, and we think about Monty and Rose, it shows us that we can get some of this cool nature in the city. It takes a little elbow grease, but maybe not as much as you'd think. And we can do so much more than we've done to create a healthy, vibrant urban ecosystem all around us. And that's what I try to do in my work at the Lincoln Park Zoo. So I want to thank some, this is not all, but some of the many, many partners that make our Urban Wildlife Information Network go. And thank you for having me and for listening. And I always posted this image in case you fell asleep and you want to know what I did in one slide. This is what I do. So this is a coyote, and you can probably see it looks a little like Magic Eye-ish or like Pixely. That's because we took all the images of coyotes that we had at one point from all of our camera traps, and we used a mosaic program to mosaic them into this image of a coyote. So if you came right up next to the screen, you might be able to see all those little boxes are a coyote. So in one image, this is what I do. I take little snapshots of animals living in different cities around the world and what they're up to. I try to piece that together into some picture of what their lives are like, how we can live with them, and hopefully move us towards a wilder and more urban future. So I'm happy to answer your questions. If you do Twitter or whatever Twitter is called now, we're on Twitter. That's our website for the Urban Wildlife Information Network. And thank you so much.
Great. Let me be sure that we can get everyone all the questions on the microphone, because people on Zoom can't hear it if it's asked just across the room.
You talked about the conflicts between people and wildlife, and a version of that I'm curious about. And you also mentioned rats. So I'm wondering about our constant attack on rats and rodenticide, and what you've seen in terms of the effect of that, and also the potential for our wildlife to help control our rat problem, and how we're maybe undoing that ability.
Yeah, that's a multi-part question. We actually have a paper coming out soon about rodenticide. And so we looked at carcasses of many different wildlife species and rats that we found, tested them for rodenticides. A fair number of the rats had access to rodenticide, I think about 50%, but almost 100% of the raccoons, coyotes, and opossums that we tested. So it's not targeting solely the rats, and it's bioaccumulating up the food chain. So it's bad, but it's also a sort of wicked, complicated problem, because you can't really tell someone whose property is overrun with rats, like, well, don't use rodenticide, it's bad for wildlife. Like that's not going to be relevant to them. So the real solution to me is sort of more long-term. It's sort of looking at our landscape and looking at our trash, how that's stored, and sort of how restaurants in particular are often the problem, and how they're disposing of their trash, because that's where the rats kind of come from. I was going to get to, there was another part of your question. Side rats.
Well, that our urban wildlife could be the solution, but we're undoing that, and so I'm wondering.
Yeah. So maybe I'm going to get controversial here. I'm not on board with the cats as a solution that a lot of people are. I've seen a lot of data on this, and my pet theory about it is I think cats are really good at killing mice. And I think we assume, well, they're good at mice, they'd be good at rats, but I think they're really not, because rats are much bigger and much meaner. Now, I do think that coyotes eat a fair number of rats, but are they ever going to eat enough to really control our rat problem? Probably not. But it probably doesn't hurt the situation, and foxes too. I bet foxes will take rats. So yeah, I wish I had if I had a great solution to the rat problem, I could retire. I would be in really good shape. But rats are really complicated. They're really tricky. And actually, a really good talk for this series would be by my colleague, Maureen Murray, who is our lead rat biologist and knows everything about rats. We work really closely with pest control companies who really do care. The ones at least we work with do really care a lot too about we shouldn't be just exposing rodenticide to the environment broadly, and we should use it in a very targeted way and very precise way. But any homeowner can go buy it and they can just spray it anywhere. So I think the more regulation on that might be useful, but then you don't want to price people who can't afford a pest control management company out of being able to control their rats. So it's very hard. Ultimately the rats don't belong here, right? They're an invasive species. They're not part of this ecosystem. Probably the most successful urban mammal of all time. We don't have any records of cities without rats. They are record keeping. So they're, at some level you have to kind of respect them, but boy, they're a problem. Long answer.
Thanks. We have Larry Heaney.
10 rat slides in this talk, and I cut them for time.
We do have a rat talk coming up in July. Larry Heaney is going to be talking. Yes.
Kidding. We work with the Field Museum on our rat program, so he might talk a little bit about the work we do.
Would you share the story, the war between the gray squirrel and the red squirrel? I think it's a wonderful story.
Oh, well, maybe you know the story better than I do. There was a guy at the Notabarret who really studied this specifically, Steve Sullivan, and he moved on ages ago. He had this program called Project Squirrel where people would record what squirrels they saw in their neighborhood. And my general understanding of what seems to be happening is that the gray squirrels are slowly pushing the fox squirrels out to the suburbs. Now, we do have a few sites where we have camera traps where you'll see both. So there are a few sites where you'll see them together, but more often in the city of Chicago and sort of the close suburbs like maybe Evanston, you see more gray squirrels. And then as you move out, you see more fox squirrels. But I don't know exactly why that is. The fox squirrels are bigger. So in a direct confrontation, you'd think they would win. But my guess is that the gray squirrels are just better at scrambling around and picking up weird little urban trashy foods that the fox squirrels maybe don't get to, and they just kind of starve them out over time. Yeah, I don't know the inner story of how that war is going. I just see the outcome of what's happening.
Okay, we have questions online, I think, too. You want to?
Yes, we have a question from Judy who asks, what about the issue of wildlife coexisting with humans and the spread of disease? How do we handle this well?
Yeah, it's a great question. So a whole avenue of our research that I did not talk about today is we have a whole department within the Urban Wildlife Institute that researches One Health. And One Health is the idea that human health, environmental health, and wildlife health are all connected. And disease is often a way we understand One Health because it's a very clear sort of flow of conflict between animals to us. And often if the environment is not doing well, the animals are more likely to get sick. They're more likely to get us sick. So as far as how we handle that, I mean, it's very complicated. I think it's very disease specific. Every wildlife disease sort of transmits differently, right? I mean, we're all, I think, now very familiar with COVID-19, a disease that came from wildlife, and we all kind of know what we tried to do about that, what worked and what didn't. Tick-borne diseases are something we work on a lot. With tick-borne diseases, we can't really eradicate the ticks. That's not going to happen. So it's really about the messaging. It's about telling people when you hike in the woods, check yourself for ticks. If you pull them off quickly, you're unlikely to get Lyme disease. If you have weird symptoms, see a doctor and tell them you've had a tick on you. And then there's others that then there are some that are very rare but really freak people out, like rabies, right? So people get very concerned about rabies. Rabies does happen. It's extremely rare, but if you get it and you're not vaccinated or treated, it will kill you. So that's important to know. I often have people call me and they say, okay, there was a bat in my house. I got it out. What do I do? And the CDC's answer is if you were ever asleep in your house while there's a bat in your house, you need to have the full rabies set because you may have been bitten and not know it. The odds of that are extremely small. But again, if it happened, you will die. So every disease has its own sort of weird connection of human health risks, wildlife health risks. But the first step, what we're really trying to do is just make sure someone, in many cases us, is out there sampling animals for these diseases, trying to understand, is avian influenza even happening, for example, or West Nile virus, is it out there happening? And if no one's testing for it, we never even know that. That's kind of our first step, and we try to do a lot of testing of wildlife out in the community. And I have another question here. I have two more. One for preventing bird and window collisions with new buildings. I almost don't want to address that because you have Annette coming, and she's going to answer that so much better than I am. There are many, many ways to prevent bird and window collisions with new buildings. What we do at the zoo, not with new buildings because we don't really have too many, but we use bird safe glass. So our glass, or if our glass predates being bird safe, we soap it. So we just or put stickers on it. Anything you can do to make the glass not so transparent helps a lot. The other thing that helps a lot is not putting plants right inside the windows, because the birds will go right for those plants and they'll smash into the windows. Those are a couple easy answers to that. But again, Annette will give you a whole presentation about that and things like that that will be way better. And then I have, how will climate change affect the distribution of wildlife in urban areas? A lot. It's going to affect the distribution of wildlife everywhere, because all wildlife species are going to have to shift their range as the world gets hotter. The question I got in the media recently is, could we have armadillos in Chicago? And eventually we could. They are in southern Illinois. They are moving north. At some point, we might have armadillos in Chicago. And cities need to be ready for these sort of weird influxes of wildlife. Something else that's happened, maybe climate change related, maybe not, but it's happened a couple times in the last few decades, is some mountain lion like wanders into Chicago. And every time it happens, everybody panics and no one knows what to do until finally some police shoot it. And I keep saying, wouldn't it be great if we had a conversation about what to do next time? Because there will be a next time. We have to not pretend that, oh, well, that was the last time, it's never going to happen again. With climate change, with animals adapting to urbanization, we're going to have weird animals showing up in our city. And I think it would be good if we were ready before that happened, instead of just panicking once it happens.
Do you see a role for the citizen scientists in all this data collection?
Oh, absolutely. There has to be a huge role for the citizen scientists in all this data collection. It's absolutely folly to work in a giant city and then pretend like the people don't live there and can't help. So, you know, I gave you one example of Chicago Wildlife Watch. Another program we have I didn't talk about, we have a program called Bat Tracker, where we enlist the public to go out at dusk and they sort of give them these like iPads with these big complicated microphones, and you walk around your neighborhood at night. And it's kind of cool because the iPad in real time will pop up like, oh, hey, a little brown bat just flew over your head. So it's sort of real-time response. If anybody wants to be part of that, I think the best email to write to is probably batsignal@lpzoo.org. We can get you connected to the Bat Tracker program. And of course, a lot of citizen science happens around Chicago that we aren't part of, through the Field Museum and a lot of other institutions that do a ton of community and citizen science. Bird collision monitors, we'll talk about that too, so when Annette's here. Batsignal@lpzoo.org, lpzoo.org.
A quick follow-up on the climate change comment. I'm wondering, with cities often being heat islands, if that would mean that they're kind of a potential long-term source as the areas get warmer around it?
Yeah, so we know that cities are urban heat islands. This is sort of sometimes this is a challenge for us. For example, you know, mostly what eliminates rat populations really is freezing out in the winter, right? So if we have these milder and milder winters, I expect we're going to have more and more rat problems because they're just going to make it. Another thing we're seeing a lot is that a lot of bird species that used to be migratory have just stopped because they're like, I don't need, you know, think about geese. All the geese used to migrate. They sure don't do that anymore. I know because they bug me. I don't like it. Anyway, so yeah, all these changes are sort of happening. And yeah, in many cases, cities may be, depending on where you are, the city may either become a refugia or maybe a really hostile place for wildlife. So like here in Chicago, where our winters are often the challenge for our wildlife, when the city's a little warmer, you may see more things hanging on, but like we have partners in Phoenix, right? Phoenix, heat is the problem. So when the city's even hotter, you may see more wildlife anyway, but that's because they have all this available free water. They have all these fountains and people watering their lawns, and that brings in the wildlife, but then the heat might kill them. So you have to really think about how all these different factors interact to bring in the wildlife that you see in different places. But absolutely, the fact that cities are warmer is something that we have to take into account when we think about all of these range shifts. Yeah. Microphone. Yes, we work with agencies like the North Shore Mosquito Abatement Agency. We work with agencies. I don't think we work with that one. We probably should, but we work a lot with Fish and Wildlife. We work with several county forest preserves. Our camera traps are in a 4-county area, so we work with 4 different county forest preserves. We work with MWRD a little bit, Metropolitan Water Reclamation District. Yeah, we work with a lot of different agencies, and we're happy to work with anybody. Just have sort of limited time. I mentioned we work with Chicago Animal Care and Control, Park District, a lot of different those types of agencies. Yeah.
How do your wildlife cameras work? Do they feed into a central source, or do you have to go out and get the data? Or?
Yeah, the question was about how you've got a mic, about how the wildlife cameras work. Yeah, so there are such a thing as fancy cameras that just upload stuff through the cloud, but since my cameras get stolen all the time, I use cheap cameras. That means we have to go get them. And we check them when they're out. We check them every 2 weeks. So yep, it's just memory cards. And I mean, I feel a little bit like that feels low tech, but my PhD advisor used to remind me that when he used camera traps, it was film. And that sounds awful. So I'm glad I never had to do that. It's always been digital cameras, but yes, we use cheap digital cameras with no internet uplink, so we have to go get them.
Just want to congratulate you on the work you're doing with young people in the inner city. That kind of program makes differences that it's incomprehensible. I have done some of that work, and it makes a difference. You meet some of those little kids on the L, and they tell you all about, they recognize you because you don't change that much. And then they want to tell you what they did, how they brought their cousins into the forest preserve for the first time and so forth. That's a wonderful program.
Yeah, thank you. And it's really heartwarming when you see some of the sort of letters from those students in their final projects where they'll say things like, you know, the only bird I knew was a pigeon, and now like I know about chickadees, I know what their deal is, and I know a female cardinal and a male cardinal, and I see them all the time, and I tell my friends, and yeah, it's amazing when you sort of open some kids' eyes to what's all around them, how much it can change their perspective, and hopefully ultimately for some of them their career path. So. Yeah, that's exactly right, how they bring that information back. I'll tell a quick story, which is Chicago Public Schools sent me a thing a couple years ago. They said, oh, we want to do this school curriculum for, I think it was for middle schoolers. And it was kind of this big curriculum, and they said, we just want you to sign off on it. And what it was they wanted the students to debate or sort of write a project about whether we should allow coyotes to live in the city of Chicago. And I sort of came back to them, and I was like, this project is really silly because we can't get rid of them. Like, they live here. Students don't want them to, they still can't. And so I really helped them to sort of reshape it along this notion of like, how should we live with the coyotes? What should we do about them? And sort of where should we exclude them from certain places and not others? What should our philosophy for coexistence with coyotes be? And I felt really good at the end of that because I think that went to like every middle school in Chicago public schools. So I was like, in some indirect way, I just affected so many different kids by sort of tweaking this exercise a little bit, and I hope having a positive impact.
Yeah. Well, what if I have like a doorbell camera and I instantly capture pictures of animals in my backyard? Is there potential for a way to like share that, or will that become useful in the future to you?
That's an amazing question. We are actually working on a project. It's stalled out a little bit, but we were working on a project with some really smart tech people who are way smarter than me. And they have a bot, and they haven't applied it for us yet, but they've applied to some other stuff. And the way this bot would work is if you posted that on social media, bot would write you and say, hey, I noticed you posted this picture of an opossum. Are you willing to give me your address, and are you willing to donate your picture to science? I'm super excited about that because you see this so much on social media. It's just this huge untapped data source. And so this company that we work with, they did this for people's vacation photos of whales. So they've got it working for that, where if you take a picture of a whale, it will write them and say, can I use your whale photo for science? Can you tell me where you took it? And with whales, since they have that, they have like specific markings on their side, it can identify like, oh, this is the same whale. So we're trying to do the same thing for urban wildlife. We actually got a little grant to do that, but the company that makes the tech is being slow about making it go. So eventually, automatically, for now, you can send it to me. I don't have like a way to compile it into like a big data set, but it might be interesting or useful to us. Yeah, always happy to hear about people's urban wildlife sightings. And if it's really cool, maybe we'll post it on our socials. I'm going to do that with your permission, of course. So it seems like we're out of time, but I'm here if people want to come up if you have questions. I'm still here. So much.